Which of the founding fathers of cooking do you think you're most like? And which one do you think is credited with opening the first restaurant? Well, if you've ever wondered where it all started, you're going to love the culinary history in today's Carefree Cook's Code. I'm Chef Todd Moore, and this is the Carefree Cook's Code, every Tuesday live at noon Eastern. Here's our challenge. How can home cooks cook freely with creativity, confidence, and pride while ignoring recipes and still impressing themselves and others with what they cook? Well, the answer is found in becoming empowered with how cooking works, using dependable and repeatable methods of cooking that work for any ingredient, for any diet, and any desire, just like chefs do. And we'll know we've cracked it when everyone sees cooking as an exciting and rewarding way to improve their relationships, their lifestyles, and their health through better food and cooking. This is the Carefree Cook's Code. Hey, welcome back to the Carefree Cook's Code, everyone. We're together again for the weekly show about the methods, the techniques, and the insights into better food and cooking. We're live every Tuesday at noon Eastern, and you can find all the past videos, if you're searching for them, in the archive on Facebook. If you go to facebook.com/chef.todd.more/videos, and if you want to see what I'm cooking and how I do it when we're not live together, those few days of the week that we're not live together, it's on Instagram as well, instagram.com/chef.todd.more, because I'm a carefree cook. I don't know if you noticed or not, but I create my own recipes. I bring friends and family together. I learn every time I cook. I create my own cooking style because I practice pro methods and I wind up loving my cooking. Pardon. When I was commuting every day, when I was going to culinary school, to the classroom, the lab on a daily basis, and I would welcome a new group of students every 10 weeks or so, there was always a progression of information that I fed them. It turned over every 10 weeks. So I kind of had a playbook. And sure, there was knife skills. There were soup stocks and sauces, my favorite class. Food safety and sanitation, very boring, but very important. All the methods of cooking that I taught in my culinary lab. But the class that I really tried to drive home, the one that I spent the most time preparing for and probably had the most passion in delivering, was the class that I'm going to show you today. Because ultimately, you can't have an appreciation for where you are in your cooking journey, and you can't have a vision for where you might be going if you don't know where you came from and who helped you get there. This is my thought process in this. So it was for the first semester students, but as a home cook, this class is even more powerful for you because it'll supercharge you with respect for where we've come from and how you can take that into the future. So this is going to be a great class today. First, I've got a what am I for you. I'm sorry, this is a true or false. True or false over here. Tell me in the comment section below. Pardon. Frog in my throat. Balsamic vinegar uses the same grape as Italian bubbly wine. Is that statement true or false? Tell me in the comments section below. Okay, so you may never admit it, but you used to take food for granted. You used to take food for granted a lot more than you do about now, right? Do you have a little bit better respect for food lately? For cooking your own food at home? I don't know who's been talking about this for a decade. And now all of a sudden, the respect that you have for your own food at home is growing. And think about it. You used to be able to sit down at a table in a restaurant. You could choose whatever you wanted from a long list of items they just put in front of you, and it got brought to you by some guy or woman. We took these things for granted, as if it's always been that way. But going to a restaurant, ordering from a menu, all these things are very new in the history of man. And here's the first thought I want you to chew on a little bit today. Maybe the first aha moment of many that you're going to have today. The very concept of a restaurant hasn't even been around 200 years, barely 200 years. And unless you were aristocracy, unless you had a name or a title, you were a merchant or a trader of some kind, someone of means, someone who had money, back when you're not even going to have access to get somebody else to cook for you for another 80 to 100 years. So even if you were a rich person, you're cooking your own stuff. But if you were an average person, you're basically digging up your own food and boiling it. That's what it came down to. Taverns, the idea of restoratives, these things were way out of reach for you. But let me tell you where it all comes from. Let's go way back. I really need that effect. Let's go back to the Middle Ages. From the early medieval times up through about the 1500s, culinary guilds were developed to dictate, but ultimately to monetize and monopolize the preparation of certain foods. There was a union of meat cookers. There was a union of bakers, a union of vegetable prep cooks, but they were a little bit more like indentured servants because the guilds were run by the royalty. Who do you think got all the money from the guild? Each guild covered the production of a certain specific types of food. So if you want bread, you got to go to the baker. The baker is backed by the Lord. The Lord gets pretty much most of the money. It's a little bit like the mafia. And a medieval lord, owner of the castle, granted by the king, the king's grant, overseer of their huge land grant, and everybody that sets foot or works on it, you had to pay rent to the lord of the landlord. This guy right here happens to be Lord Charles Calvert, the third Lord Baltimore. Okay, it's a different place than we're talking about Paris, a different time, but he's still the Lord. He's one of my favorite ones. He's a Lord Baltimore. All right, so this lord who got the land grant from the king, he had to have a pretty huge kitchen staff. And each of the kitchen staff had a specific job in the kitchen. We talked about this two or 3 weeks ago, I think, during the Carefree Cooks episode called How Many Chefs Does It Take to Get Dinner Done? You remember that one? During the episode, I offhandedly mentioned, hey, would you like to see some kind of culinary history episode? And everybody was like, yeah. All right, so here we are. You asked for it, okay? So if you remember from the How Many Chefs episode, I had gone to a very fancy restaurant that operates under the classical brigade system. And I wondered out loud to myself, in my head, and then ultimately to you, how many chefs did it take to make this meal? But to go even further back, the origins of that meal or any meal in a restaurant goes back to a medieval castle. And here is the current Lord of Baltimore in front of his castle in Scotland. You not buying that? No? Okay. Again, wrong guy. I am not a Lord of Baltimore. I'm not even in Baltimore there. Wrong place. All right. Just to keep your attention. But what I'm telling you is totally true because in the medieval kitchen, duties were separated by the food item to be cooked. The rôtisseur was responsible for roasting meats. The pâtissier was responsible mostly for poultry, but also did pies and tarts. And the vinaigrette made sauces and stews. So when you look at some of these French words from back then, you see the contemporary word in there. Pâtissier, pastry, is the baker, the pastry baker. But interestingly enough, it's a little known fact, that poultry was baked in pies. So early on, sweet items, sugar was hard to come by. A baker was not a sweet item baker. A baker was a poultry roaster and baker of pies first, and then sweet things and pies second. I'm sure you've heard of the cold sauce that you make when you put vinegar and oil together, right? A vinaigrette. just like the person was called that made it. Okay, so that's a lot of French words, I know, and there's a lot more to come. Stand by, and I'll massacre them all. But while I understand that every culture and every country has their own culinary history, there is a Mexican culinary history and a Spanish culinary history, and on and on and on. It's the French history that I'm going to focus on today because they are credited with inventing the restaurant. And as a chef once told me early in my career, the French, he said, gruff chef, the French didn't invent a damn thing. The Italians invented it, and the French were the first to write it down. Isn't too far from the truth, but not the topic for today. All right, so where were we? Oh, yeah. Okay, so we're in a dark, deep, and damp, dreary castle with dozens of guild cooks in the medieval times. Doesn't that sound fun? But now, what's starting to happen out and about in Paris and throughout major cities in France, there were places that would prepare food for you, but the charge was for the room. And this all started in the late 1600s. The word tavern. You went to a tavern, but a tavern wasn't the place that you would think about today. It wasn't a bar. It was more like an inn. And taverns offered sleeping rooms along your path from place to place, and the sleeping room came with a restorative, something to help restore your health and vigor after your journey. You got the free meal with the room. It was a restorative. Think about this for a minute. You get the restorative in the tavern. A lot of times it was just a broth or a soup or something like that. But by the end of the 1600s, the guild members were given a new legal status. So guild members that were no longer with aristocracy, that you had to work for a lord or aristocracy, they were now given the status of being for hire professionals instead of indentured servants. And they were called traiteurs, Traiteurs, traiteurs. That word today is a caterer. Okay, more than a chef. That's what my pal Pascal in Paris called me, traiteur. Traiteurs were the first caterers. They focused on making sophisticated meals for the wealthy at their residence. It's 300 years later, I'd call it a house gig. Okay, you go into someone's house and you cook for them. They're cooks for hire. But this is a new thing now. And since the taverns and cabarets are serving a little bit more like grilled meats and stews, again, poultry pies were big things, the traiteurs saw a real opportunity. So the traiteurs started to offer these things called hosts' tables. A host table was where you went to the traiteur's house or an area and you paid a price to sit at a large table with other guests and eat a fixed menu. It was a prix fixe family style dining, right? I used to do this in my catering company, my traiteur company. We used to call it supper club. We would have people in my cooking school. They would cook 5 couples. They would cook a meal and then they would sit down and serve it to them. My God, those were the days. But anyway, you could go to a traiteur back then, go to one of these host tables and sit down, or you would get the leftovers, the scraps and things, the other roasted meats. You could get takeout from a party that had expired, from a traiteur, from the guild members that weren't doing this, weren't working in a castle, weren't working for lords. They went back to focus on their specific thing. You could purchase roasted meats from the rôtisseurs that now have carts on the marketplace. Savory pies were sold by the pâtissier, the duck, the goose, the chicken pies. I think of this as today's food trucks. You go to some municipal area and you got all the food trucks around. This was the start of the food truck in the 1600s. But slowly, you can see more commercially prepared food becomes available to more and more people. But here's the question you wanted to know. The earliest establishment given credit for today's modern format, the service-style restaurant, was in 1765 by a man who's always been called boulanger. Every book I've ever read, every time I've done this research, and it's been quite a few times, it's boulanger. But I dug up something again recently that dug a little deeper, and that was more the name of his place. The guy's name was Mathurin Rosset de Chantisseau, Chantisseau. Toiseau, very French, Chanteseau. Monsieur Chanteseau had a place that was a boulanger, all right? So it's confusing, but you see the words on the storefront there. He was a traiteur, he was a pâtissier, he offered his own trademarked, even though there wasn't such a thing then, his restorative. And his famous restorative was a bouillon. It was a broth, a meat-based broth with egg, and he advertised it to restore health and vigor. And some of the stories report that Monsieur Boulanger's or Monsieur Chanteseau's restorative, what it was he was getting sheep's feet from the local sheep farmers, and it was sheep's feet simmered in white sauce. Now, if I know what I know, the collagen in the sheep's feet, this was a bone broth. Today, people are drinking bone broths for health and vigor. So anyway, so this restorative in Chanteseau's restaurant in 1765, this was a wild sensation and widely credited as being the first restaurant menu item. You could walk in, you didn't have to have a room, you could walk in and you could get Boulanger's restorative. So no matter whether it was sheep's feet or a broth or whatever it might be, Boulanger or Chanteseau's place, this was the first elegantly decorated. They had tablecloths, they had china. They began offering a list of items, not just the sheep's feet dish. They are credited with offering macaroni and pasta from the royal court in Paris. His establishment, he's changing things up now. He called himself a traiteur/restaurateur. He is a traiteur, a for-hire cook that makes restoratives. But his place in Paris is the one noted as offering multiple items on a menu in an elegant atmosphere with table service. It's the first restaurant. So you got all this great stuff going on, and then along comes the French Revolution, the biggest impact, the atomic explosion that sends chefs scurrying everywhere, the traiteurs, the guildsmen, the tavern owners, the cabaret cooks. Most of these professional cooks at this time roaming the countryside, right? And when the French Revolution came, his lordship, the lord of the land, he was out of a job, no kidding. And perhaps a few inches shorter at the top, as they used to say. And all the servants and kitchen staff are roaming the countryside. I imagine unemployed chefs everywhere. Mon Dieu, what will I do? And they started doing what they knew best. They got back to cooking. And that's when the number of restaurants exploded in Paris, the freedom of expression. And all throughout Europe, as governments started to change, populations grew, populations became denser, and commercially prepared food became more easily available to average people. So in the early 19th century, these traiteurs, these restaurateurs, they simply became known as restaurateurs. But keep in mind, and this is an interesting part, a restaurateur is not the place. It's the person. You went to visit the person. And this still exists in Europe. When you could travel, anytime I interviewed a restaurant owner in Paris, they didn't tell me about their famousness, or so they always talked about the food and the guy that was making it. But it wasn't until the 20th century that the restaurant became the place and not the person. So rather than for-hire cooks, the location became the place. And now we have chefs that have been released on the general public, and they start to change the way that food is presented. And remember, most of these guys cooking for royalty, they only knew elaborate 20-course banquets. They didn't know how to keep it simple for the average person. You've been working for lords and royals. You've been working for the rich for a very long time, and a 20-course banquet is not a very good business idea. So these royal chefs needed to adapt, and many of them didn't. Many of them did. And those that did change their ways also changed culinary history forever. So the background of these people coming out of aristocracy, coming out of royalty, being given the right to sell food to the public, these are the people that became the forefathers of modern cuisine. And I'd like to introduce you to a few of them together. And now that you know, none of these guys invented the restaurant. None of them. The restaurant predates culinary history. Like I just explained, chicken and egg? Egg. No, chicken. Restaurant before forefathers, and here they are. The first is Antoine Careme. He lived from 1784 to 1833. He is the father of grand or haute cuisine. Poor guy, abandoned by his parents at the age of 10 at the height of the French Revolution, and he worked as a kitchen boy in a cheap Parisian chop house, it said, in exchange for room and board, like a tavern. But he quickly became noticed in culinary circles, and by 28 he was cooking with and cooking for some of the most famous chefs and diplomats at the time. He was the cook for Napoleon at 28 years old. Careme brought his commercial food service mostly to the wealthy, using his knowledge of lavish royal buffets and banquets. He developed these rich, intricate, elaborate meals consisting of dozens and dozens of courses, but he really wasn't keeping up with the times when it came to what was being cooked. But he did have a huge impact on the kitchen itself because he dismissed the idea of the old guild system. When the guilds were no longer kicking back to the lords, okay, then you don't need the guild anymore. That one guy had to cook all the meats and one person had to cook and so on. He dismissed that. In the kitchen, he emphasized procedure and order where specific duties were performed by each station rather than a person. So the beginning of the classical brigade system as we know it, the thing we talked about a few weeks ago, is credited to Careme ultimately. He's credited with inventing the first chef's toque, the tall pleated hat. He's credited with inventing the double-breasted chef's coat with the long sleeves to protect you from spills and burns. He changed meal service from placing all the courses on the table at one time. They used to just bring out 21 different things and put them on the table at once. He created a long list of the items, presented them individually. He created a very long list of sauces. Many of them seem really archaic. But he started the first list that the mother sauces will be created from. He's the foundation of that. So look, if you love elaborate, if you love the big family dinner, if you love Thanksgiving, you're Team Careme. You're probably a lot more like him. The next founding father of cuisine is Auguste Escoffier from 1846 to 1935. He is considered the father of classic cuisines. He was called the king of chefs and the chef of kings. Although, depending on the book, you can find that quote attributed to Careme as well. So, make it up and write it down just like history. So whoever writes it down first gets history. But unlike Careme, Escoffier, he never worked in an aristocracy, in a household. He never worked for royals. He started, because of the time change, he started in his uncle's working class restaurant at the age of 13. Never had a chance for the royalty, but he rose eventually to work in some of the finest hotels in Europe. He simplified everything. This overly elaborate, the fussy procedures and classifications of Careme's haute cuisine, he thought it was total chaos. He would say, Careme is chaos. He reduced all of Careme's elaborate systems, all his elaborate sauces, all the classifications. He brought it down to just five mother sauces that are still taught and recognized today, taught by me today as well. It's that important. Escoffier sought simplicity, balance. He said you should have just a few superb ingredients rather than a complication of the mass of variety. I subscribe to that as well. Escoffier is known for organized discipline. He moved the word restaurateur to chef, is credited with creating the word chef. This is now a profession with a set of organized principles. This goes from the building to giving credit to the person. So simplification is what it's all about. Simplification was Escoffier's goal. Now we come to more modern days, kind of. Fernand Point, from 1897 to 1955, he is considered the father of Nouvelle cuisine, considered the father of new French cuisine, because it gets very complicated and very heavy sauces, but he modernized all this classic cuisine of Escoffier. So a little bit like a funnel. It gets simpler, it modernizes, it gets newer. Escoffier, if Escoffier thought Careme was too complicated and ornate, Point probably said the same thing about Escoffier. Ho, 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 great chef joke. I'll save that for the next chef's convention. Look, remember, we're starting out with guilds in castles, indentured servants, right? These guys have always had trouble keeping things simple, but Point, he hated all this. He hated dominating thick sauces. He hated the elaborate garnishes. He believed that each dish should have a single, simple, dominant flavor or theme. I subscribe to that as well. Don't confuse me. Communicate with me on the plate. Garnishment, he said, should be matching like a tie to a suit, to complement and communicate. I think that's probably where I got that from. He helped usher in a trend toward much lighter food, much more naturally flavored food, simply prepared food, using the natural ingredients. He put a lot more focus on the food than the procedure and the elaborate procedures. His procedures, a lot more direct and simple. Use the highest quality ingredients. Don't do it in the most complicated way. Highest quality ingredients in the simplest way rather than what you shot this afternoon in the most complicated way, all right? So that's basically where we are today. And yeah, I could continue with a long list of contemporary chefs who are constantly moving cuisine forward. I don't want to leave anybody out, but it's impossible to include everybody. James Beard, Julia Child, Alice Waters, Charlie Trotter, Roy Yamaguchi, even Justin Wilson, one of my favorites. They have all brought something since Carame's time. All of them together, though, as they contribute, as we move cooking forward, they cannot match the together, combine the turbulent beginnings, the revolutions, the change from aristocracy to the public. They can't match the turbulent and violent times that is the beginning of selling food to the public on a table from a list of offerings. So let me wrap this up. Let me ask you one last question. Which one are you? Do you hear any of them in you? I want you to define your cooking today. If you were a first-year culinary student, I would be all in your face about now. Who are you? You are about to start this culinary journey. You're investing thousands of dollars to change your career. What's your purpose? What's your goal? Where are you heading? Are you Careme? You love big, elaborate banquets? You're going to cook the big family dinner, a huge event? If you see yourself cooking on like Downton Abbey, then I think you're Team Careme. Define it, own it, love it, move forward. If you think that's a bit too much, if you think it's a little too elaborate, too much work, too complicated, you might be Escoffier. But look, Escoffier, he didn't play at all. He supposedly was a madman. Do others say that you're a little tough to get along with in the kitchen? Do you have to do things your way? Okay, maybe you're Team Escoffier then. Or are you chill? You think it's all good, man. It's all light. It's all cool. It's all casual. Very uncomplicated. We go with the flow. Hey, know anybody like that, right? We're all still learning. We're all taking these steps of discovery together. We are all working on our own culinary journeys together. If this is you, then you're Nouvelle. Then you're Team Point. You're a little bit like me. And you know what? Maybe you're a little bit like each of them. We all have each in there, but when you understand where you came from, you know where you're going to. So which are you? Which one are you? Name the founding father chef that you think you're most like in the comment section below. You got to pick a team. Team Point, Team Escoffier, Team Careme. So now that you understand why I really bring it when I'm teaching this class to tomorrow's chefs, is because you got to know where you're going. If you don't know where you've been, you can never figure out where you're going. If you don't have respect for the past, you cannot create the future. So you don't have to open a restaurant to know about this stuff. You can just cook better at home knowing about this stuff. And I hope you enjoyed today's quick bit of history. It's really fascinating to me because it gives me an even greater appreciation of where my cooking comes from. Okay, time is short. Let's get back to the true or false today. True or false, balsamic vinegar uses the same grape as Italian bubbly wine. Balsamic vinegar isn't really a vinegar in the strictest sense. That's another class I can teach. It's really of like a fermented syrup, right? Lesson for another day. But balsamic vinegar is made from Trebbiano and Lambrusco grapes. Lambrusco is the Italian bubbly wine. This one is true. Everyone who said true, 10,000 extra points for you. And if you know someone who could identify with one of our founding father chefs today, someone that could use a little bit more perspective on where food and cooking really comes from, please love, and share this video with them. And if you'd like to start your own culinary journey, be able to cook any ingredient in any style for any diet or any desire, like a restaurateur or a traiteur, get my free guidebook. It's the 5 Forks to Carefree Cooking. It'll show you the way. Go to 5forksguide.com to download your free copy right now. And until next Tuesday, where we again take more steps toward breaking the Carefree Cook's Code, this is Chef Todd Moore reminding you that there's a method to your cooking success. Bye, everyone.